Welcome to a crash course in Ink. In this video, I'm going to talk about variables and functions. So when we talk about programming terminology, the two most common terms are variables and functions. In different programming languages, they can mean slightly different things, but generally, a variable is some way to hold some type of data, and a function does something with data. Those are very abstract and sort of generalized definitions, but they can help us as we approach those two different concepts when using them in Ink. So we know we have a variable that holds data and a function that does something, usually works with data in some way. So let's move over to code. So using the Inky editor, I see I have my code on the left-hand side and my preview over here on the right-hand side. Well, the first type of variable I'm going to create within Ink is what's known as a global variable. So I've used the keyword var, V-A-R, all capitalized. I'm going to call this name. Then I'm going to use the equal sign to set its initial value to something enclosed within open and closing quotations. In programming terminology, this is known as a string. It is a collection of letters, numbers, and other special characters. It can even contain spaces and underscores and everything, but what marks it as different is that it is enclosed with an opening and closing quotation marks. This is a string, some collection of characters. So I've used var, V-A-R, all capitalized, to create a global variable. Now what I mean by this terminology of a global variable, which means that I can access this anywhere within the story. It is available at a global area. This is different from another type of variable within Ink called a temporary variable. So let's look at the differences here. So I have my first global variable using the keyword var, V-A-R, all capitalized, called Dan. I've set its initial value to the string Dan. So we have name is equal to Dan. So now I'm going to create a new knot, call this beach, and within this, what I want to do is show the value of this variable. So I'm going to say my name is, and then within opening and closing curly brackets, put the name of the variable. However, we can't currently reach this knot because there's no way to get to it. So we need to divert to the beach. And now we notice that that knot has run out of content. There's no end of that flow, and we need to divert to end. So we see first use global variable of name is equal to the string Dan. We then diverting to beach, which is our knot. Our knot starts on line 5, and we see my name is, and then the value of the variable name. So I mentioned that one of the things we can store are strings. Other things we can store are decimal values. That is 4 point something or something like that. And we can also store whole numbers. And finally, we can store booleans. Now, booleans take its name from their inventor, Boole, who came up with these two different ways of approaching complex systems. Their values are either true or they're false. And so we have those two keywords to work with as well. So we have 4 different types of values we can save within variables. And I'm only mentioning global variables right now. We're going to get to temporary variables in a moment. So we can have strings enclosed and open and closing quotation marks, decimal values, 4.5, something like that, whole numbers, which don't have a decimal part, and booleans, the value true or the value false. So if I want to show these, as I mentioned, I put them in opening and closing curly brackets. And we see here we have name and we have the value of decimal. Now, I mentioned that there's 2 different types of variables. There are global variables, which we can access anywhere. Notice we established them at the top and we're accessing within this knot. There's also temporary variables. Temporary variables are only available within the knot or function in which they are created. So we have this knot here, and what I want to do is create a new temporary variable. Well, we do that using a single line of code. So within Ink, we have two different approaches for using more complex code syntax. The first of which is a single line. A single line is marked with a tilde, and then a space, and then some code. And this marks it as a single line of code. So I'm going to create a temporary variable using the key term here, keyword temp, and call this new name is equal to Steve. And notice we have a string value, opening, closing, quotation marks around it. So now we have a new temporary variable named Steve, and I can show this by using the same approach I was. And notice over here on the right hand side it showed us this new name Steve. Well, let's divert instead of the n to a new knot I'm calling Forest. Create a new knot. Let's make sure we give this an n to start. So within this new knot, what I want to try to do is access the value of new name. Now we can't. Unresolved variable. So a temporary variable with the keyword temp is only available within the knot or function in which it is defined. This is different from the global variables created with var keyword. So we have these two different types of variables. We have variables that exist on global levels. When we create them, they're accessible from any location in the story, any knot in the story, or temporary variables which we can create using a single line of code that starts with a tilde that are only available within the knot or function that created them. So we can access new name within beach, but we can't access new name within forest because it doesn't exist anymore. And this, as this shows, an unresolved variable. So these are the two types we have, temporary and global. I mentioned at the start of this video I was going to talk about variables and functions, and I've seeded that keyword a little bit in here as we were talking about things. So previously, when we were looking at this video, we have knots, which are different locations in the story, and we use diverts to move between them. Well, the other thing we can create that looks similar to a knot is what's called a function. And this borrows again from programming terminology. And I mentioned at the top of the video, it's something that does something with code, or does something with data. So we have our variables, which are storing our data, are either strings, opening, closing quotation marks, decimal values, whole values, or the booleans, either true or false. These are all different values, data we're holding in these variables. Or we can do something with that data, or do some type of small task. And these are functions. So let's get rid of this error code, and in fact we'll get rid of forest, and I'll come back and write this as end. And then we want to create a new function. Well, a function looks similar to a knot, in that it starts with the equal signs, but it has the keyword function. It also has an opening and closing parentheses, and this marks it as very different. And it's something that's important about functions that we can use to our advantage. So I have this called change name in this function. So what I'm going to have it do is create a single line of code, and we're going to change name is equal to new name. Well, this may seem weird. Where's new name? Well, new name I'm going to add up here in the opening and closing parentheses. So we've got a single line of code, name is equal to new name, and then I've got a function called change name. And I put that variable name in the open and closing parentheses. Well, in programming terminology, this is part of its arguments, or sometimes known as its parameters. So these are information it accepts. It accepts data, and when it accepts this data, it puts that data in this variable. So we can send data to a function, have the function do something, and then return to what we're doing. So what I want to do then is take out this new name stuff, lines 11 and 12, and instead change name. So I'm going to write a single line of code here and go change name, the name of this, pass in this time the string Steve. Now, the name is Steve. So what I've done then is created a function that changes some data. I've created a single line of code with the tilde within line 16 here, passed in data, new name. It then became that data, and then we assigned it over here to name. So we're changing the data using the function, which is how I introduced at the beginning of this video. We talked about variables holding data, and we talked about functions changing data, or functions doing something. Now I could also make this more complex if I wanted, and we could have it do additional things, but this is actually a pretty good start. So we've established these two different things here. Variables which hold different types of data, strings, something enclosed in opening and closing quotation marks, can hold decimal values, whole values, or booleans true or false. We also say we can look at the value of variables by putting it with an opening and closing curly brackets around it. And so we have the value of the variable as we see over here on the right hand side. Right here, line 9, my name is Dan. Line 10, decimal is 4.5. Then we introduced single lines of code, and these start with a tilde and allow us to write a single thing. It does a single thing on that single line. And so then I introduced functions as working with data in some way. We learned that functions look like knots, but have the function keyword in front of them. And this signals to Inc that this is a function and not a normal knot. Then we notice that we can send data into functions by using open and closing parentheses after its name and then its parameters, things we are sending to the function. We saw I can send a value to a function right here on line 11 by sending the string Steve into the function, which then became the value of new name. New name was then the value that was changed for name. Name became new name. So we've seen then we can construct functions that work in this way, that do some small task on data, and then allow us to separate that code into its own function. So the other thing that functions allow us to do is return data to close this out. And I kept mentioning this idea of return data. This makes it very different, makes knots very different from functions. Because otherwise we could construct these very similarly. We could divert to a knot, do a single line of code, and divert back or divert to something else. However, with a function, we can also return some type of data. So what we're going to do then is mix this up even more by adding a new single line of code, calling this old name, and now saving the current value of name when it enters the function as the temporary variable old name. Then we're going to change name to new name, and then we're going to do one final single line of code, use the return keyword to return old name. So what we've done then is we're saving the current name, changing the name, and then returning the old name. Now I talk about this concept of functions returning. Functions can then return values as well. So what we're going to do then is set this up here on line 11 as temporary old name, and we can call it old name because the temporary variable old name only exists within this knot, and the other temporary variable old name only exists within this function. They are temporary to those knots and functions. Because remember I mentioned that earlier, when we moved between knots, we didn't see those temporary variables. So we can have temporary variables with the same name in different knots because they don't exist outside those knots. So we see there, I'm saving the result of change name by sending the parameter Steve into this. So I'm going to say name is name right here on line 12, looking at the value of the variable name, and old name is Dan. So this is another use of the function, as I mentioned. We can send some data in, do something with that data, as well as get data back out of it, which is something we can't quite do with knots in the same way. We could sort of divert to a knot and maybe do something and then divert to a different thing and do something else. But functions allow us to do it very simply. We can send data in, get data back out. We get the data back out by using the return keyword. And within this function especially, each new line was a single line of code starting with the tilde. and then we use the return keyword to return old name. So we sent a new name into it, saved what is now the old name, changed the name, and then returned the old name. So we're still making the change, but we're also returning whatever it was, which happened here on line 11. We returned the result of a call to the function change name. Right here, an old name. Then we showed name, which has been changed, and old name, which is the result of that change. So two different major concepts, variables and functions, covered within this video. Variables, we hold some type of data. Functions, usually we change data or do something with data in some way. We can create functions that look similar to nots, except they use the function keyword, and they have the major difference that they can return data. Variables, as we saw, have both global and temporary status. If created with the var keyword, VAR, all capitalized, they exist in global, which means they're available on all locations within a story, or they're temporary variables, which means they exist within the not or the function in which they're created. And we see in this final example here, we have old name as the same name of a temporary variable in both the not beach and the function change name, which is allowed because the temporary variables are only defined within the not or the function which defines them, and then they don't exist afterwards. Thanks for watching.